Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. Mrs. Millie, our teacher, is really silly. Every day she says, "Good morning, children. Please hang up your goats." Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our coats. At 8 o'clock, our teacher announces, "Please rise for a frog salute." "Oh, no," we shout. "You mean flag salute." "It's 9 o'clock. Time to write," said Mrs. Millie says. "Get out your paper and penguins." Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our paper and pencils. At 10 o'clock, it's recess time. Our teacher looks out the window. It just stopped raining cats and dogs. Don't step in a poodle. Don't you mean a puddle? We asked, giggling. We play outside till our teacher blows her whistle. "Recess is over," she yells. "It's time to chameleon." Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean it's time to come in. At 11 o'clock, Mrs. Millie says, "You may get drinks, but don't cut the lion." You mean line, we yell. At 12 o'clock, our teacher announces, "Time for lunch. Wash your hands with soap and walrus." You're silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean soap and water. As we get in line, Mrs. Millie reminds us, "Don't forget your lunch bunny." "Oh, that's right, our lunch money," we shout. Mrs. Millie puts on her glasses to read the menu. They have gorilla cheese sandwiches today. Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean grilled cheese sandwiches. At 1 o'clock, our teacher picks up a book. It's story time. Come sit on the bug. You're so silly, we cry. You mean sit on the rug. At 2 o'clock, Mrs. Millie calls us back to the back of the room. It's time for art. Who wants to paint on the weasel? You mean the easel, Mrs. Millie. How can you be so silly? We ask. After art, our teacher asks, "Who's hungry? We have parrot sticks and crackers." We know what you mean, carrot sticks and crackers, we yell. At 3 o'clock, Mrs. Millie smiles. What a fun day we've had, but it's time to go home. Put on your bats and kittens. Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our hat and mittens. When we're ready to leave, our teacher goes to the door. "Butterfly, children." "No, Mrs. Millie," we shout. "You don't mean butterfly. You mean goodbye." Mrs. Millie laughs. We laugh too. "Butterfly, Mrs. Millie. See you gator." And we wave goodbye as we get on the octopus. The end.